First of all, good afternoon to all the present there. Thank you very much for the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology to have me on this panel. I really wish I could be there in person. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible for me. So regarding my presentation, it concerns a work in progress, which is part of my PhD research in history of technology. And it focuses on ways and instruments that sound out aspects of the atmosphere. And it's also a result of my recent and emerging practice of making environmental sonification instruments. Environmental sonification being the display of environmental data using sounds. So think of the Geiger counter, it detects, it quantifies radiation, and then displays it as clicks, as sounds. So it's a very well-known sonifying instrument. However, in what concerns recent artistic practices, environmental sonifications have become very much entwined with strategies to raise awareness. Although I think there are other factors in play that justify why they are so compelling as an approach, and I'll speak to that later on this presentation. But what brings me here is that I'm very interested in questioning how the epistemological meets the aesthetic, how the cognitive blends with the affective in the construction, deployment, and experiencing of instruments that sonify atmospheric phenomena. And the framework to do so is what I'm developing and what I'm now tentatively calling atmospheric acoustemologies, which bridge the static theory of atmospheres with the framework of acoustemology. So for the remainder of this presentation, I will discuss these concepts. I'll present some historical examples, and I'll do a very synthetic overview of recent artistic practices and look at how all of these fit within this approach. So starting with acoustemology, many here might already be aware that it is a portmanteau of the words acoustic and epistemology, coined by anthropologist Stephen Feld. And it describes what can be known and how it can be known through sound, as well as the context-specific role that sound plays in the construction of a sense of place and or belonging to a particular community. So it is a habitus, it is a set of tacit knowledges and sense-making that come about through listening and sounding as experiential and relational living. Meanwhile, atmospheric scholarship states that bodies are immersed in conditions that result in encounters with particularities that render affective spacetimes as distinctive and intense in terms of sensory perceptual experiences. So traditionally and colloquially, we're referring to moods or dispositions, what lingers in the air that affect us while remaining in excess of a full description. We know, we feel, but there's always something vague about that. Think of the electric atmosphere of a party or the somber atmosphere of a vigil or a burial. Some authors, like Tim Ingold or Derek McCormack, emphasize the notion that atmospheres are not just states of mind produced by the aesthetic experience of a situation. They argue that the strength lies precisely in connecting the affective with the materiological, the subjective and the sensitive with the material. In this vein, Tim Ingold's concept of the weather world has been especially influential. For Ingold, weather is the basic condition of being exposed to the elements and their variations that temper not only our lives, but the quality of all interactions in the environment. So we are in a constant material affective exchange with the atmosphere, and weather in mood or temperament become unified in our experience. And for me, this is important because it also implies an expanded notion of weather that can also include the affective potentiality of the physical-chemical weather of pollution and other atmospheric substances. So now I'll carry on showing how some artifacts might illustrate these concepts. And Juan has already introduced the Aeolian harp. I'll just do a small foray into it. It is a good example of an instrument that, when it sounds, provides both an aesthetic and a cognitive experience of the air. So throughout the centuries, its sounds have amazed listeners by their tonal complexity and the mystery of their operation, being especially impactful to writers and poets of the Romantic period. Historians of science Thomas Hankins and Robert Silverman argued that the Romantic heard in it either the desire for transcendence or the unpredictability and agency of nature. So for these historians, this instrument allowed the Romantics to probe and express directly the sublimity of nature. However, others tried to formalize the scientific and epistemological possibilities of the instrument. Some 18th century scientists, especially in the north of Italy, sporadically studied it as a meteorological instrument. Most notably, the abbot Julius Cesare Gattoni kept a journal between 1783 and 1785, describing the making and the sounds of his harmonica meteorologica, a long stringed harp which he hung between his tower and a nearby building. So Gattoni desired to make a new instrument that would be able to predict the weather more precisely than a thermometer and a barometer. And he took diligent notes where he related the sounds of the harp with the state of the weather at the time of the sounding and in the days after. But he doesn't seem to have been successful in achieving his ultimate goal of acquiring a replicable scientific knowledge on this subject, as other researchers occupy this time. What strikes me is that Gattoni also wrote of sweet sounds that the wind would pluck from the strings and noted how the people of the village, as well as outside visitors, would wonder at the mystery of its sound making. Additionally, he would claim that villagers would learn to listen to the strings and be able to make predictions from the sounds that they heard. So now, this for me is very interesting because I found a similar example in the Portuguese windmills, where instruments called buzzers, also known as whelks, were tied to the sails. So like we see here in the images, it usually consists of an arrangement of gourd-shaped clay vessels or reeds that act as a sort of windpipe organ. And like the wind harp, they create a drone, and its volume, frequencies, and complexity increase with the speed of the wind that passes through. As far as my knowledge goes, these are exclusive to Portugal and their origins are enigmatic. They probably appeared around the second half of the 19th century in the west region of the country. So this is in fact my PhD case study and is very much unresearched. There's only some sentences here and there in ethnographic accounts of the 20th century. However, both scholars and millers of the past and the present claim that the song of the buzzers assists in the effective and safe operation of the milling process. It allows millers to know the strength and velocity of the wind, warning when to start and stop the milling process, as well as how to regulate it. They were also very helpful at night, as these sounds woke up the millers, calling them to work. So they have to work when the wind is right. And if the wind is right at night, this was a way for them to know. Similar to Gattoni's harp, common are the claims among millers and scholars that both the millers and local populations could predict the weather by scrutinizing the sounds of the buzzers. So changes in tones or their direction might signal the coming of storms, rain the day after, or even dangerous wind speeds. For farmers, they claim it was a warning not to go out on the fields. Moreover, it's also common to present these instruments as mediators of a non-human agency, this time one that also operates as a work companion. So millers refer to the singing of the buzzers or the chant of the wind or the chant of the windmill as something that keeps them company, that enlivens and beautifies the space during the long hours of lonely work. And on another matter, I'm also concerned how the buzzing windmills impact the soundscape and community relations. And beyond nostalgic accounts of how in the past the hills and the valleys were full with the song of the windmills, one notable piece of information is that they were forbidden near dwellings by council ordinance in at least one region at the start of the 20th century due to the noise that they made at night. So we might have here contrasting feelings about these instruments, and I think it's an interesting subject to pursue. I think that these two cases, harps and buzzers, they exemplify the ambiguous status that such instruments and the associated listening experience inhabit between the cognitive and the affective. Their ability to express the force of the wind is articulated for the listeners as a perception of reality that is entangled in feelings of curiosity, sublimity, animism, and aesthetic pleasure or nuisance. And for the most part, I think these continue to be fundamental characteristics of various artistic sonifications that presently attempt to strengthen the connection between audience and environmental issues. So examples abound, and they are growing every day. But we could talk about, for instance, works of climate change sonification, which are very popular, where climate data is used to create a sonic experience of the progression of the climate crisis and its various social and environmental effects. And Andrea Poli's works are very well known in this vein. Works like Heat and the Heartbreak of the City or Sonic Antarctica. And other themes can be related to water, air, soil pollution, or even species decline. In my own works, I create sensor-based instruments that sonify some of the main air pollutants in outdoor and indoor environments. So here I'm going to show two works that I have exhibited. One is the Atmosmancer, which is a small air pollution measuring station working as a 4-channel installation. And the other one is the Weatherworld harps, which is composed by different groups of prepared guitars, each manifesting the real-time concentrations of a specific pollutant by being actuated in different ways using electronic sustainers and motors. And the motors make different materials strike the bodies of the guitars, which then produce different sounds that I can relate to different levels of pollution. So in both the cases of the Weatherworld harps and the Atmosmancer, an algorithm composition makes pollution levels determine sound actuations, transformations, and panoramic movements. And since the sound sources are spread out in space, they create an informative ambience. So I believe, following Sasha Engelman, that the atmosphere and its substances, they present challenges relating to their cognition, expression, and imagination. They are appealing in the creation of what Derek McCormack calls atmospheric things, that is, artifacts and artistic explorations that make the meteorology affectivity of a place more palpable and enveloping. So sounding out the atmosphere involves the creative challenge of expressing something physical that is not always perceptible. And this involves the layering of a second atmosphere, a texturing of space, which resides in the unfolding of the real-time sonification. And the atmosphere figures as an alterity that co-creates the work. It's becoming its dynamism that moves the sonification, and what gets to be known is the appearances of states that might elicit a certain response. But also it signals that the technologies and the elements are there and they are acting. So looking at the past, for instance, whenever windmill buzzers sounded, they signal a certain state of the weather, but they also signaled their own presence and that of the windmills at work. And so they seem to have acted as sound marks that attuned people to the milling activity and their weather worlds. So today we can listen to the late afternoon hike in nitrous dioxide levels expressed by the agitation of a drone made by an air pollution sonification instrument. And this is a way to make explicit the presence of a dangerous pollutant released by traffic, a warning maybe to close the windows, but more fundamentally a way to sense the commute of the city, to attune to its rhythms and particular instances of its weather world, and hopefully to pose questions about urban mobility paradigms. So taking these things together, we have a poetics for the expanded perception of the atmospheric that I think is captivating both for creative work as well as for environmental awareness. So as a preliminary conclusion of this work, old and new practices of sounding out the atmosphere become atmospheric acoustemologies in the sense that they make knowing the atmosphere a question of cognition, feeling, and imagination. They heighten senses of experience, place, and socio-ecological dimensions of being immersed in a meteorological affective medium. Such sonifications explore the atmosphere as an alterity that collaborates in the work and which has a degree of enchantment and allure, two fundamental aspects of atmospheres according to Derek McCormack, because they play a game between bringing attention to phenomena that are normally overlooked, like air pollution, while making everyday experiences and places appear strange and otherworldly. And with that, I'm finished. Thank you very much for listening. I think I finished with time, right? If you want to listen, if you want, I can put in just the sound of the buzzers of the windmills.
Yes,
just
please.
a few seconds. Can you listen? Is it working?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from the room or from the Zoom room? Come on up. I have a webcam. It will be.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting. I was only able to catch part of it, but so I was wondering, so the idea of atmospheric listening is really enticing with its like multimodal sensing, but also what are the challenges? I guess like there, from my experience, there has been challenges in kind of reproducing that to, for example, audiences, especially a lot of times in a virtual accessible format. So what are your thoughts on providing or making that experience of atmospheric listening engaging, accessible?
Wow, that's a challenging question. I need to understand, you're talking about how can we make more sonifications about air, about the air or different phenomena in the air, and how can we broadcast it on the internet and make it accessible for people? Is that it?
To make it more specific, because me and my friend here, Maya, we both work with transducers in our practices, and that is like a trend, that translates vibrations in sound that is bodily engaged. But also, we're just talking about there's this other presentation that talks about sound walk in games, and I feel like game is especially a thing that usually has an oral scape that's so directional because of the limitation of putting it virtually. So like, I guess like, what are the ways that we can recreate an atmospheric listening experiences?
Well, so I think for one, you have obviously non-electronic ways. That is some of the ones that I've showed here. The other ones is obviously like the creation of. So one thing is that so atmospheres are always being created. So in a sense, a game has an atmosphere, and precisely if you walk around the game and you listen to it, you'll be also engaged with that sonic atmosphere. So I think, at least for me, the challenge to do, for instance, air pollution sonification and make it more available is definitely always concerned with the equipment and the pricing of equipment, and so of course a small weather station is very easy to make, but mounting it on places that want to have it mounted, it's also a challenge. One thing that I cannot do, for instance, in Lisbon, is just go out and put my guitars wherever I want, because someone will come, like the police will come, and if I have an amplified instrument, immediately I cannot be on the street with it without a license. So that's a challenge that I find. I don't know if I'm answering your question right.
Thank you. We have a question from Zoom, and you can read along. I'm going to read it out loud for the live room. Could you elaborate on what does divination and attuning to environmental sonification mean in your research?
Well, divination obviously it pretends with a prediction in this case, and it's very much. I'm following here a little bit more of a natural magic tradition. I'm not doing a natural magic tradition, but as I follow these instruments along their historical path, the case of the weather world, the case of the Aeolian harp is very it's very iconic here because it was very much at first related precisely with a more sublime experience of trying to predict the weather. So divination here would be mostly a way to say that it's a prediction of the weather. Attuning is precisely that action of being more connected to the rhythms of a certain place. So of course, no, the windmill millers, they were very much attuned to their weather world because of their work. So they didn't know that the weather was changing only because of the sounds of the buzzers. They know very well that the weather was changing because of the currents of the wind. So if the current of the wind would change, they would know that maybe a storm was coming. But the buzzers here, they helped them when they weren't facing the wind, or where they weren't looking at the weather vane, or when they were simply at home sleeping. And so this for them meant an attunement to that particular moment. And in the case of the populations that we see in various of these cases, they talk about how they also became more aware of the not only they were attuned to the weather, but they were also attuned to the work that was going on in the mill. So they knew that the mill was there. So if they wanted some flour, they could go there. Another aspect is, and for me, with my works using air pollution, sonification, it's very interesting to have these instruments playing throughout the day, and suddenly at night or at the end of the day, as I was talking about, suddenly some of the levels of pollution just go through the roof and they start to rise and rise and rise. And I'm listening to them, and I'm not in a place within my town that it's near a big large chunk of traffic. What's happening is, as the pollution is being diffused throughout the town, some of it is entering through my windows, and then suddenly I become aware of that commute, and so that's for me what also attuning means. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That came from the Zoom room. All right. Well, yep. And Juan had asked that question and says, thank you.